Crisis in Jubilee. What's happening in Russia? Russia's spiraling into a deep crisis. It was visible before the war, but now it's rapidly accelerating. And every major crisis entails mass redistribution of power, property and status. Because crisis is essentially a jubilee thread. In ancient Israel, every 49th year was the year of Jubilee. Jubilee was a huge managed default, debts forgiven, indentured servants released, the land cleared of debt and returned to previous owners. Jubilee annuls any obligations you took previously. You don't owe anything now. The most obvious element of Jubilee are huge queues before Russian ATMs standing day and night. Previously, you could delude yourself that your bank deposits are what you own. No, it's what you borrowed to the bank. This loan can be defaulted on, especially during the Jubilee. It's more obvious with bank deposits, but honestly, cash is also a loan. It's something they owe you, and what they absolutely can default on. For example, in form of hyperinflation. Normal inflation is a gradual default, or hyperinflation, a rapid one. The true Jubilee.
В период кризиса она говорит, можно маслица возьму? Я говорю, возьму. Я говорю, возьми. Она говорит, Димочка, ну оно 800 рублей стоит. Вот эта бутылочка драная, вы представляете? В подвале разливают его где-то там, в Подмосковье стопудово, в Мытищах. 800 рублей, 500 миллилитров масла. Нормальная история. А доширак, кстати, чтобы вы понимали, уже 50 рублей стоит. А раньше собак кормили голодных на улице дошираком. А сейчас...
This Jubilee happens on all levels. Oligarchs' assets frozen. Russian central bank assets frozen. It's the annulment of obligations to both Russian state and private actors. Arrest of mega yachts are just the most visible element of a general trend. Seize what you can seize. It goes both ways though. Recently friends asked if they should take ruble loans with 30-45% interest rate. I said, yes, do it. Inflation will be way higher and Jubilee will cleanse your debt. Borrow rubles, convert them to USD, cash out in store. Jubilee is a time to borrow. During the Jubilee, the best strategy is to borrow. Take obligations in order to establish a direct grasp over some resources, then convert them to STH robust. Resources will remain yours while obligations will be cleansed by the Jubilee. Like hyperinflation destroys your debt, now let's think in higher orders. Financial capital is debt. It is the obligation. It can be defaulted on. The same however goes for other types of capital, social, political, administrative. They all can be borrowed and all can be defaulted on, especially during the Jubilee. Imagine a dictator has appointed a provincial governor. Thus governor has borrowed power. It's a debt the governor owes. He'll be closely checked and controlled by his creditor. And yet, the Jubilee allows the debtor to default. Keep what you borrowed. Annul the loan. Break free. During the Soviet Jubilee of 1989 to 1991 this was happening on all levels. Whoever borrowed some direct control over resources, privatized them. They cashed out and defaulted on their loans. State-appointed CEOs became oligarchs. Governors became kings in their provinces, and so on. Jubilee is asymmetrical. Annulling the debt, it benefits a debtor and hurts a creditor. That's true both for financial and for political capital. One crucial concept to understand dynamics of centralized systems is the distinction between the barons and the courtiers. Courtiers are those who manage central power and give orders by its name. The chancellery of the king, the presidential administration, the company's HQS. These are central authorities and modern communications allow them to increase their power beyond any reasonable limits. Barons are in direct control over resources. They can be provincial governors, CEOs, generals. They borrowed power from the center but can't use their leverage fully, because they're closely controlled by the courtiers. The court must punish them often just to keep them at check. Now what's happening during the Jubilee? Barons borrowed their power from the courtiers, but debts as FTN obligations are annulled, which means the power of the center is diminishing rapidly. Courtiers used to be everything and will become nothing. Barons, the other way around. Consider the fall of the USSR. The Communist Party was the leading force, the supreme power that checked other institutions. It was above everything and everyone. It was the sole creditor of power, everyone else borrowing their authority from the party and being their instrument. For decades, the party career was the best in any sense, giving the access to the source of the supreme power. influence at the court. But in late 1980s the trumpets of Jubilee started blowing, and the more street-smart of nomenclatura realized they need to cash out immediately. Consider Matvinko. She had been doing party career for many years, but when the trumpets of Jubilee were blown she cashed it out and transferred to the diplomatic service ASAP. Party was the creditor of power and credit is cleansed by the Jubilee. You need to cash out right now. Less than in a year USSR collapsed and party lost any influence. Its debtors who borrowed their power from it defaulted. Dumber members of nomenclatura were fucked, while street-smarter ones who established direct grasp over some resources before the Jubilee were doing greatly. Now Russia is spiraling into the new Jubilee. Finance-wise, that's obvious. Sounds crazy, but since Russian invasion Ukrainian hryvnia has been rapidly appreciating against ruble. In expectation of Jubilee people get rid of Russian currency ASAP. Monetary loans will be cleansed. The same is true for the loans of power. During the Jubilee it's better to be a power debtor, to have some direct control over valuable resources which give you leverage than to be a power creditor. So the crisis inverts the normal relations between the courtiers and the barons. That goes on every level. Typically politicians and bureaucrats in any country will at least try to cash out their administrative leverage for monetary benefits, and it's delusionary to expect otherwise. And yet, can they do it and how effectively? It depends. Before Putin's rise, baronial power in Russia was very high. Local, municipal, regional authorities had vast autonomy in how they administered their territories. Even the lowest administrative apparatus, of towns and rural districts, could totally feed off the local economy. Previously there were collectible local taxes. Many towns, districts, regions filled their coffers through taxation and thus were independent from Moscow. Since 2000, Putin has been centralizing all collectible taxes as the federal revenue. Regions, blue, were turned to beggars. That was facilitated by the corporate centralization. Previously there were many smaller companies registered and paying taxes in regions. Over time they were destroyed or consumed by huge federal corporations registered and paying taxes in Moscow. All money flowed to Moscow now. Before corporate centralization local authorities could easily feed off local businesses. Smaller officials could impose tribute on shops, street markets, gas stations, larger ones, on regional banks. They also did a lot of street magic with logistics feeding off the trade flows. In Putin's era these feeding opportunities, kormlyanaya, were taken from barons and given to courtiers, especially to Putin's friends. Consider the history of Platon system. For decades truckers operated through shady schemes and their businesses were not transparent to Kremlin. This lack of transparency was unacceptable. So, in 2015 government introduced the Platon electronic toll system, Platon. It was administered by Igor Rotenberg, the son of Putin's close friend. Basically, every trucker had to pay a toll per every mile to this private enterprise. Here you see a Platon control car that checks the road so that not a single trucker can pass without paying cash to the Putin's pal. Everything should be transparent, so that courtiers would feed off the goods flows directly, bypassing barons. Of course truckers protested. Of course there were huge strikes and of course it was all suppressed. Some went out of the business, considering it unprofitable now, while others submitted and paid the toll to Rotenberg per every mile. Platon's story shows how courtiers centralize money flows and rent-seeking opportunities, which in Russia are called much more directly as feeding opportunities, in their own hands, at the pretext of increasing financial transparency. There's not much rent left for the barons. The last significant rent-seeking opportunity for barons was residential construction. It needs so many permits, so difficult to proceed, that even town mayors could profit lavishly, buy agricultural land, reclassify it as the land for housing, sell to developers at huge profit. Nowadays, however, funding of up to 80% of residential development projects in Russia is centralized at Moscow banks, which are directly controlled by the courtiers. They pressure businesses to direct money flows through their banks, so that rent goes to them and not to the barons. For his entire career, Putin has been centralizing power and money flows in Moscow. Being a baron was less and less lucrative, both regarding formal and informal incomes. Paradoxically, Kremlin imposed on regions as many social and welfare obligations as possible. There were two simultaneous trends. On the one hand, Kremlin was reducing their income flows with every year, taking everything to the federal budget. On the other hand, expenses on education, medicine, much of welfare were being delegated from Kremlin to the regional budgets. Regions became heavily indebted and about 20 of them were put on the brink of default. That created anger. Consider the Russian media headlines. Russia forgave loans to Africa, Kyrgyzstan, Mozambique, Venezuela. Ministry of Finance designed sanctions for indebted regions. This wasn't stupidity or altruism towards foreign countries. It was a deliberate policy. Forgiving the loans to Mozambique is okay, because Mozambique elite is not a political threat to Kremlin. Meanwhile, Novgorod elite absolutely can be a political threat and needs to be weakened. Kremlin launched the war on regions not because it hated them but because courtiers aimed to keep the regional barons weak. In their crusade against barons, courtiers inflicted huge socio-economic damage on regions. It wasn't a goal but rather a collateral damage in the elite war. Being a baron is quite dangerous. Governor of Khabarovsk Fergal pretended he doesn't understand he needs to do electoral fraud and allowed Putin to get a low vote count in his regions. Overall, 10 governors were arrested since 2014 when confrontation with the West escalated. The case of Fergal is especially interesting because he was unusually popular and political motivation of his imprisonment too obvious. Mass protests in Khabarovsk region continued through 2020 to 2021, but in vain. Of course nobody would release him. Much of Russian politics of recent 20 years becomes more understandable if we consider this constant tension between courtiers and barons. The former fear the latter and consider them as potential threat. They'll wage on them even if it damages on a country as a whole. The bill of Klishchevsky recently confirmed by the Russian parliament was the apotheosis of the courtiers' crusade. Called as the law on public power, it effectively eliminated the last remnants of federalism, imposing direct rule by the federal center. To start with, all state employees in Russia, including elected politicians from the regional and city legislative assemblies, now will become federal civil servants. They'll get privileges but also obligations and will be directly subordinate to the unelected staffers in Moscow. Furthermore, since 2000 Putin has been increasing the number of regional cabinet positions that had to be confirmed by Moscow. This new bill suggests of them need to be confirmed. So even if the governor is elected, all of his cabinet will be comprised by the appointees of Moscow. The bill is huge and has many vague propositions which I'm not sure how to even interpret. For example, it might abolish the richest oil-producing regions at all, but the message is clear: building a unified vertical of power, stripping regions and municipalities of any autonomy. Of course the bill was confirmed by the Russian parliament, and yet, very unusually many voiced their opposition to it. Many regions tried to introduce amendments, especially richer northern ones, like Yakutia. They have resources and thus naturally value their autonomy more. While many cities and regions objected to the law, Tatarstan was the most active. It introduced about 30 of 100 amendments. Its legislative assembly voted against the law unanimously. Even more surprisingly, a bunch of Tatarstan MPs in Russian parliament voted against, too. That's highly surprising. In Russian parliament you are not supposed to vote against what's been introduced by the higher-ups. You can only rubber stamp. You shouldn't even discuss the bills. As Gryzlov, the leader of United Russia, told Parliament, is not a place for discussions. There were two interesting aspects of this vote. First, 6 Tatarstan MPs from the United Russia Party voted against the law, and they were not punished. United Russia declared it will not be disciplining or excluding them. Government wanted to proceed low-key, minimizing the fuzz. Interestingly, supposedly liberal and oppositional Moscow establishment supported the bill. Consider this headline by oppositional Medusa, criticizing Tatarstan for resisting it. It's edited to be more politically correct. Original headline was "Don't they want too much?" If you think about it, this article looks so realistic. It's chastising the region for disobeying the federal law. Meanwhile, they had to include the following disclaimer labeling them as the foreign agent in accordance with the same Russian federal law. Isn't it beautiful? So an oppositional media which is persecuted by the federal center, deplatformed, labeled as foreign agents, still absolutely 100% supports this federal crusade against regions. They're enraged at the thought that barons dare to even object to the courtiers. Why? Because they want to become courtiers themselves. Moscow liberal and oppositional establishment is glorified all over the West as heroes. They indeed are persecuted and deplatformed, but what they fight for is absolute, unlimited power, power without any checks. Consider Navalny, the oppositional leader, who is almost deified as the political martyr. After he decided to start the contest for power, Navalny had to become much more hypocritical and politically correct. Otherwise, he would hardly find much support in the West. Previously, however, Navalny attended Russian marches, ethno-nationalist manifestations. They used different tricolor because they consider Russian official flag to be too inclusive. Russian marches were the main magnets for neo-Nazis and militant right wings. Consider his blog posts from a few years ago. Belarusian language is something magic. It looks like their script was invented by Kachi, ethnic slur against the Browns from Central Asia and Caucasus, and Podunki, an internet subculture, purposefully breaking Russian orthography. When Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, Navalny suggested full blockade of Georgia and deporting all Georgian citizens from Russia. He called Georgians as rodents. In Russian it sounds similar, Gryzerny rodents versus Gruzini, Georgians, and lamented Russians can't just launch a rocket on their army HQ. Navalny's debate skills are quite impressive. Damn, you are a faggot. Faggot and also a Jew. Faggots are being banned here. Not speaking about the Jews. Now Navalny is in jail and suffers a lot. Do I think he is a political prisoner? Yes, absolutely. Would I support giving him total, unlimited power over a huge country without any checks? Not quite. Honestly, I don't see how his ethno-nationalist agenda is different from Putin's. You may ask, how can we know that Navalny didn't change? Maybe we should judge him by his recent actions, equals when he made every effort to become respectable in the West. IDK. Maybe he did change. We'll truly know only if he gets unlimited power and will be free to do whatever. Navalny isn't an exception. He is the rule. Much of liberal oppositional establishment in Moscow fights against current courtiers, but they also fight to replace them and take their place with all of the power it brings. That's why the idea of someone resisting Kremlin enrages them. Let's sum up. Much of current Russian political dynamics is understandable in the context of conflict between the courtiers and the barons. In the normal times, courtiers will centralize all the power and all the cash flows in their hands. That's why Kremlin increases regional expenses and cuts their revenues. They must be always on the brink of collapse so barons couldn't challenge the courtiers. That's why Russia forgives loans to Mozambique but not to Novgorod. Novgorod barons are a threat and must be weakened. In the peacetime, Russian geography, economy, institutions favor the courtiers over barons. Putinism is simply the courtiers winning. However, the Jubilee entails a major redistribution of power, property and status. Anyone with some control over resources may try to default. These conflicts and negotiations regarding the power debit and credit are very visible now. Consider the following. Kadyrov sent a lot of his troops to Ukraine and was remaxing their engagement. He declared he went there personally and posted a video from a basement near Kyiv.
По подходу к этому детскому дому была выполнена. Та стратегия, которую вы нам подсказали, она сработала на 100%. Мы не стали делать зачистку этого села, не стали заходить с флангов, делать разведку, а сразу по-наглому на скорости подошли непосредственно к этому детскому дому. Быстро его заблокировали, проникли внутрь, но, к сожалению, детей там не оказалось.
And yet, Kremlin didn't confirm it. When asked about Kadyrov's visit to Ukraine, Putin's press secretary Peskov told, "No, we don't have such information. It's unlikely that Kadyrov went there without Kremlin knowing anything. More probably, Peskov just accused Kadyrov of lying." Kadyrov not only sent his troops to Chechnya, but launched a massive PR campaign propagandizing them. Chechen fighters are putting Chechen flags on Ukrainian military bases. They're cheering Kadyrov and his father. Kadyrov clearly strived for military glory and fame of conquest.
Что мы пришли сюда вас защищать. Вас не будет обижать, трогать, убивать, это вообще не входит туда. Вы вообще не должны об этом думать. Сейчас все будет хорошо.
It looks like this public rise of Kadyrov makes Kremlin administration anxious. Did you notice that Kremlin is never PRing its own generals? They always report, Russian troops captured this or that town. They never mention a specific general. They don't want to give them fame. If you allow the generals' names to get into media headlines, you give them fame. Their image rises, their status, too. Soon, they may become independent political figures. In 1990s it was happening a lot, so later Putin had to accident all these famous generals this or that way. Imbeciles in social media interpret Kadyrov's PR campaign as him being very, very loyal to Putin. Kremlin probably thinks otherwise. This campaign with Chechen flags raised over Ukraine makes Kadyrov too independent. It's a default on borrowed power, so Kremlin gonna sabotage it. Kremlin is quite successful in neutralizing inner threats. Thus he shouldn't expect any major rebellions in Russia. When I traveled to Dagestan, for example, I got an impression that a successful rebellion is impossible there. Dagestan is full of Russian military, police, state security. Unlike Chechnya, which has zero feds at all, entrances to every village which potentially could rebel like Gyumri are guarded by armored vehicles 24/7. They check everyone coming and leaving and will react immediately. In Russia there are only two warlords with personal armies, Kadyrov and Shoigu. Kadyrov's army is known much better. That's understandable. It's far bigger. All of Chechen military, policy, FSB, etc. are his army. It is located in European Russian and can easily engage in Moscow. Shoigu's army is less well known. First, it's small, probably less than 500 men. It has BMPs, drones, but no manned aviation. It's also very far away, in Tuva. Tuva so remote and disconnected from the rest of the country. It can be hardly used for contesting power in Moscow. What we should expect all over Russia is not so much a rebellion as a sabotage. Officials are not that stupid. Their position becomes horrible. The country is spiraling into an apocalyptic crisis. The quality of life is dropping and someone should be held responsible. They will. Officials will become scapegoats blamed by center for any socio-economic problems. People are stupid, much dumber than officials on average, and many'll believe it, especially the elderly who typically think that any economic problem are due to a bad governor-mayor, not to Putin. There's another aspect to this problem. Russia has huge, very corrupt and very rotten political and bureaucratic class. While barons are suspicious to Moscow and can be effectively used as scapegoats, courtiers are just too expensive to maintain. They cost money, devour resources. There's no realistic way Putin will be able to keep such huge apparatus as he developed over the years of expensive oil. He bred them, but can't feed them anymore. Firing them en masse would be stupid. He'd create enemies. So the best thing to do is to launch a purge. I'm quite sure that in the near future we should be expecting mass house arrests or arrests among the bureaucrats. They can be justified through political accusations, accusations of corruption, of incompetence, whatever, but the reason would be saving money on their maintenance. Many officials will grab as much resources as possible, equals borrow power, and then low-key default. Like every smart opportunist did in 1989 to 1991, nobody will rebel. Many will sabotage. For example, many will try to keep as many consumer goods in their region to keep discontent down. Much of sabotage will result not so much from a discontent against Kremlin but simply from prioritizing prevention of collapse in their own territory institution at whatever cost. With technological chains disrupted and hyperinflation growing, barons will be breaking supply chains. This elite dynamic should be considered both when considering current sanction policies against the regime and planning what to do further. Pushing one band of imperialist courtiers out of Kremlin just to put another one on their place isn't really worth it. End of thread.